It's been a long day, but I hope you found it's a very fruitful day as well. There's certainly been a variety of presentations on different aspects of COVID, and there are plenty more things that could be said. Just to reiterate that in April, Messenger Press are publishing a book which contains a longer, more presentations. There are about, I think, 16 presentations, 16 chapters of reflections on the COVID crisis from a theological, pastoral, philosophical, even canonical, liturgical, etc. Viewpoint. So a variety of presentations. And it also begins with an interview that Pope Francis gave to Austin Ivory, not the latest book that he's published, but this was one that was given last March. So anyway, so that'll be out from Messenger Press in April, and it's only $9.95. The college is giving it a bit of a subsidy, so to make it affordable to people. So, and as I say, 16 different chapters. So what you had at this conference, plus almost the same amount again. So you're very welcome. And in a few moments, we're going to begin with the first of our three speakers for the last session. Okay, so the morning was to do with seeing, the early afternoon looking especially at the scriptures, discerning. Can we discern through reading the scriptures? And now we're moving more towards acting and how we respond in the face of the COVID pandemic. And obviously, the way we act and what we can do is a bit different from what we would normally do. But anyway, so three speakers, the first from the educational viewpoint, the second one from the moral viewpoint, and then the third one, almost we could say from a kind of spiritual and reflective viewpoint. So our first speaker is going to be John Paul Sheridan from Ferns, a priest of the Ferns Diocese, Director of Education Programs for us at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. He wrote a book in 2004 on parents and confirmation, promises to keep. Then in 2012, another book on religious identity of primary school student teachers, the God that I, is it do or don't believe in? You can tell me what the correct title is. Anyway, so over to you. And your topic today, COVID-19 and the spiritual lives of children. So over to John Paul.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I will sort of go on to my presentation. And I have a short film, but I'm not sure. Okay, I'll stop sharing this and go on then to my presentation. Folks, that is a piece by a Turkish artist, and it is of a Syrian refugee. The boy is deaf, and he can't. What he is showing you is not, traditional sign language, but I use it in my class for the students to kind of give them an indication that when we talk about the experience of the child and putting that experience into a particular context, and also putting that experience into a particular meaning, that the student, that there is a very strong identification in terms of children with their experiences and making meaning from those experiences. If you looked at the thing again, you would see that he's basically sort of mimicking, there's a sense of urgency with him to try and get his story across. And the gestures that he uses are almost ballet-like. He doesn't have traditional international sign language, but it's very, very clear, some of them. And the fact there's no water, houses were searched, documents were torn up, and then executions. And I say this because one of the things that I decided to write on was basing it on the spirituality of childhood. I want to talk a little bit today, for whatever time we have, on parents and educators, and then learning within the domestic church. So in terms of spirituality, this is from Mackdale Reynolds, and they talk about this idea of children's spirituality as seen as the capacity children initially possess to search for meaning in their lives. So if we think of anything in terms of spirituality for all of us, that sense of that search for meaning, but also within the context of that search for meaning, it being directed in a particular way. And many of the people who have writing, and I'll introduce to some of them at the moment, I'm sure some of you are aware of them, have written extensively on the way that children can very, very easily and very, very succinctly understand something beyond themselves in terms of a search for meaning in their lives. Spirituality is embedded in everyday life, has influence over the life of the child, and shapes the child's way of being. Two things on that. First of all, when we come to talk about the primary school program that is in Ireland today, which is the Grow and Love program, we talk about it from the point of view of beginning with the experience of the child. And when we begin with the experience of the child, then it's very, very easy for us to then introduce the Christian story and vision, the various elements of what we want. But beginning with the experience of the child focuses it on them as we'll see later on, agents and participants. Okay. And then it is influence over the life of the child in the sense of the way, if you take that particular video of that child and the experience, how long it will take for the child to come around to an understanding that that's not the way life is or should be normally, but currently it is the way and the experience that he has had so far. And also in terms of the way that we see children's spirituality embedded in everyday life gives parents and indeed educators access into sort of a language and also a set of experiences then that we can begin to look at from a religious point of view. Now, it's important that this spirituality possessed by the child be nurtured and stimulated. When we talk about children and we talk about the sacrament of baptism, and we talk about the way in which the gift of faith given to a child at baptism, one of the things that we do, and one of the things that religious education and catechesis does, is nurture that faith. We tend to have this image of, handing on the faith, like we get a big bag or a big kind of, pile of stuff, and there's everything we need to know about faith, and we'll hand it on to the child, as it were. That has a certain sense of irrelevance, but I think there's something more subtle about it. And in terms of talking about children's spirituality, something more subtle. An image that was used in Alive O, the much maligned Alive O, was the idea of Jesus as the diviner. The diviner is, you know, for those of you who know a diviner is someone who goes out into a field and finds water using a stick or whatever else. So a diviner is someone who finds what is hidden and brings it to the surface. So as regards us as educators and as regards us as well, not me, but parents, we find what is hidden within the child, which is the gift of faith, and we bring it to the surface. Now, it turns out that children, partially by virtue of their distinctive psychological characteristics, have an intriguing, rich capacity for spirituality. One of the things that you constantly hear often with commentators and people, you know, talking about faith is, oh yeah, I was very, you know, when I made my first Holy Communion, I was very spiritual. I was very this and very that and all the rest of it. But, you know, as time went on, sort of, you know, that began to change. There is anyone who writes about children's spirituality today, and the field is quite rich, talks about that child's initial capacity and the rich capacity for spirituality, for a kind of religious knowing or being which is neither contingent on their religious knowledge or moral accountability. So in other words, it's sometimes, yes, we can see it based in an understanding of a Christian story and vision, you know, as the child gets a little older, say from the time of, you know, second, third, fourth class, up to sixth class, perhaps, that it is. But before that, you know, a sense of thinking of things outside themselves, thinking of a higher power, higher being, whatever word you want to use. Now, I've just laid out three in particular. Robert Coles writes that children are young pilgrims, well aware of that life is a finite journey. Brendan Hyde talks about children's spirituality in four specific characteristics: felt sense, integrating awareness, weaving threads of meaning, and spiritual questing. And then Hay and Nye, that's David Hay and Rebecca Nye, developed the term relational consciousness. So it's the capacity for finding connections between the self, others, the world, and then a transcendent power of God. And all of these, you know, will hark to the notion of them being agents and participants. Some of you might be familiar with some of these writers. One in particular is Robert Coles. Robert Coles was professor at Harvard. And the reason why I mentioned this one is because Coles was one of the first people to interview this particular little girl portrayed in this painting by Norman Rockwell. This was Ruby Bridges, who was one of the first children to go to an integrated school in rural Tennessee. New Orleans, where's New Orleans? But anyway, he interviewed her, and you know, about her experience and what it was like to be standing as you can, or walking as you can see her in between four US Marshals, and you can see what's scrawled on the back wall, and then, you know, all the rest of it. And I just thought it was kind of, I suppose, appropriate after the swearing in of the first African-American, first female vice president yesterday. So Coles has written extensively, and his book is still very much in print, The Spiritual Life of Children. And Coles, as I said, never has an unpublished thought about children in the sense of the various different ways in which we look at children. You know, he talked about the spiritual life and the political life and this, but he talks about that idea of young pilgrims, which I think is a beautiful way of you know, talking about children, and a beautiful way of talking about them in terms of their spiritual life. The agents and participants, children are not seen as passive recipients of religious education and catechesis. As spiritual beings, teachers, and educators should see children as active participants in their spiritual lives and growth. Those of you who have experience of classroom will know and understand that, you know, in terms of a lesson, in terms of the way in which they might view a lesson, or they might talk about a particular religious education lesson, you know, that, and it's very much in the Grow and Love program, you can see that the way in which they, as I said, begin with their experience, and then from there move on to talking about, you know, sort of questioning the story, and what's the story, what's at the heart of the story, what's the meaning, and then what does that story mean for me? That they're very, very active in trying to, attempting to understand what it is you know, that what that story has in terms of the meaning for their own particular lives. This agency does not negate the role of the adults. The adult becomes one who journeys with the child and offers the wisdom of their faith life, their learning, and their experience, which I suppose is which is the intersection in terms of the world in which we're today. That, you know, sometimes parents are quite reluctant to see in terms of their own lives, well, what have they got to offer children? Sometimes, you know, I'm talking to parents, they think, you know, well, I don't know much, you know, I couldn't possibly do what, you know, the teacher does, but no one is expecting you to do what the teacher does. But if you look at the same sort of paradigms out of which the teacher is teaching in school, then that idea of beginning with the experience of the child, and then seeing the child and trying to sort of bring the child along to an understanding in terms of whatever, you know, a story from the gospel, for instance, is that, you know, they have their own thoughts and they have their own ideas, and they look at a story in a particular way and in a particular manner. Sino says, educators, parents, pastors, and other adults can best nurture the spiritual life by walking with them on the journey. I've said that already. Becoming co-learners with their children in our quest to know God. According to them, the adults should sometimes lead the children forward along the path, and at other moments the child could guide the adults as they seek together the presence of the living God. If you go back to the young boy from the refugee camp, and you see the manner in which he can articulate without any nuance or without any sort of, you know, sort of flowery language. He doesn't have language because, you know, all he's capable of are grunts. He hasn't learned how to speak because of the fact that he's deaf. But when you see it in the fact that he can very, very clearly get across his message, that sometimes, you know, when we're sort of faced with a particular story within the context of say a Bible story or a particular moral situation or a particular feast within, say, the you know, the season of you know, the church's calendar or whatever it is, the children will have their own particular sort of thoughts and their own particular you know, sort of their own particular thinking on it. And that sometimes, you know, Nye says that, you know, parents should talk, or adults should talk less and listen more. They should watch more and intervene less, but intervene better and be prepared to learn from the children. I sometimes found, because before I had this job, I was a Dawson advisor for primary schools. And sometimes I found that when you went into a class and they were clever children, that sometimes it was far better, you had a far better understanding of where they were in terms of their understanding of faith and all the rest by the questions that they asked me, as opposed to any questions that I may necessarily ask them. And it was very clear from that point of view where exactly they were. And I think that's true, you know, that parents sometimes are sort of a little reluctant to, you know, to sort of let the child explore what it means, you know, according to a particular story, or, you know, a child may be preparing for the sacraments, you know, okay, well, you know, they're preparing for the sacrament of reconciliation. So let's talk about, you know, what it means when we don't do what we're told, which is something that a child has learned from a very early age, beginning with the experience of it. So what happens when that happens? You know, and equating, you know, sort of, we fail and we fall short, and we, you know, sort of we're outside the situation of the family because, you know, we've hit our sister or we've taken something on our brother or whatever it is. And then, you know, what happens is a reconciliation within the family. And in doing so and in saying that, the child sort of instantly understands what it means to be, sort of to be part of a family, to move outside that because of what we have done or what, and then to be reconciled, which is, the correct way in which we should talk about that particular section. We used to talk about confession, which was the telling, penance, which was the punishment, but reconciliation, I think, is the best. The catechism, I'm conscious of time. Catechism, sort of talks about this in the terms of the domestic church, that Christ chose to be born and grow up in the bosom of the Holy Family of Joseph and Mary. And these families became believers, were islands of Christian faith in an unbelieving world. I think, in many respects, that's very, very true and very, very relevant when you talk to families who are trying the best they can to bring their children up, that sometimes they are actually islands of Christian faith in an unbelieving world. One of the things that was talked about when the Grow and Alive O was Martin Kennedy, who many of you might know. Martin talked about the three islands of religious existence: the home, the school, and the parish. And that for a program to be successful, we had to create links between the three islands. But now, one of the things that came from that is whether those three islands actually exist. And the island of the home, the island of the school, the island of the parish, the island of the home and the island of the parish dwindling to a certain extent, whereas the island of the school still being very much there. But, that idea of the island of Christian life in an unbelieving world, for parents of faith who want to pass on something to children, it can be a very, very strong reality. This, I think, this is also in the article. I think it's one of the things that that I'm very, very passionate about is the Directory for Masses with Children, a document which came out in 1973 and didn't really get the traction it really deserved. But in many respects, it was a way of trying to understand where, in terms of catechesis and religious education, children found themselves within the celebration of the liturgical assembly. And it says all who are concerned with education should work and plan together to ensure that the children, besides having some idea of God and the supernatural, should also, in proportion to their years and degrees of maturity as persons, have experience of those human values which are involved in Eucharistic celebration, acting together as a community, exchanging greetings, the capacity to listen and to forgive, to ask forgiveness, the expression of gratitude, and the experience of symbolic actions, conviviality, and festive celebration. So I've just bullet pointed those. And as you can see, any one of those six, in fact, all of those six, can be part and parcel of, a family today in isolation, in lockdown, acting together as a community, exchanging greetings, a capacity to listen, to forgive and to ask forgiveness, the expression of gratitude, and the experience of symbolic actions, conviviality, festive celebrations. You think of, families coping with a small house, or coping with an apartment, or the need to speak to one another, the need to act together, to listen, to forgive and ask forgiveness. Those human values which we see as part and parcel of a child's emerging understanding of Eucharistic celebration are the very ones that can be honed and can be built on from what they learn in terms of home. At the end of the particular chapter I mentioned these 4 particular questions for discussion and reflection. During the month of pandemic, received what elements of religious formation have children missed out on? During these months, what elements of religious formation have children gained? How can a family become a domestic church in the reality of daily life? And in your experience, what can children teach adults about God and spirituality? And maybe I'll leave those as ways in which, if anyone wants to ask a question or has a thought. The other ones which come from Sheridan, again, sort of are based on the children's spirituality. We must help children to value their inner lives. They need to build the children's curiosity and their early experiences of wonder, to help them develop language for articulating feelings. Because you know, if you think back to the boy in the refugee camp, he didn't require language to get his point across, but in the way in which that story might be told again and again, you know, for a child, language is important. He used the language of gesture. He used the language of his hands, and all the rest of it. But how we assist children in terms of developing their language, or articulating feelings, but also articulating something of the divine. And the aesthetic sensibilities and interpersonal sensitivity. The aesthetic sensibilities, one of the things that the directory talks about is that idea of, you know, how art and how religious art and that adds and enhances the children's celebration. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much to John Paul, a very full and helpful presentation, and obviously based on your years of experience working with teachers and in schools.
What advice do you give to parents homeschooling? Two things. First of all, the Grow and Love, which is the primary school program on the island of Ireland, has a website which supports a lot of the work, and that website has been made available to parents free of charge. So some of the ancillary material, like video clips and things like that, are there for parents to use. What I would say is, you know, in the same, one of the things that I'm you know, when it comes to students, and one thing that comes out in a lot of the documents around religious education and catechesis is that religious education should be seen with the same academic rigor as every other subject. Now, what I mean by that within the context of homeschooling is that, you know, that religious education has a set time as well. You know, yes, we're furiously trying to understand what the hell the maths is all about, or, you know, we're not too good at the Irish or whatever else, but there is, you know, in terms of what they're doing, you know, and when books are sent home, that, you know, can I have their Grow and Love book as well, please? Okay. What strikes me is Christ's statement that we need to become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. The writer Karl Rahner, the theologian, I should say, he uses a great, he says that the childhood is infinite openness to the infinite. Some of you have heard me use that expression before. That one of the things about children is that they are constantly surprised and constantly delighted by new experiences and all the rest of it, and constantly open to new ways of looking at things and fascination and all the rest of it. And I think in one sense, that infinite openness to the infinite is certainly something that we can learn from childhood, yeah. It is a case that we all need to be passive and disposed to reception of grace in the spiritual life. But we have to be passive, but we also have to be active as well, because sometimes, you know, in the sense of going, looking, you know, go in haste, like Mary, go in haste. Mother Teresa had a beautiful theological method in a speech that she gave at Harvard a number of years. She said, you know, for the poor, she said, if you go look for them, you will find them. If you find them, you will love them. If you will love them, and you want to do something for them.
I just felt that was lovely there, John Paul, because in the secular world, you know, people are beginning to believe that children are empty vessels just to be filled up with stuff. And it's lovely to hear your theories behind them, the spirit being within them, and that we need to nurture it, and that it's already there. And I work with children in a primary school, and you can see it every day in the interactions. They come with their little hurts and their little worries, and you just talk to them and they listen, and you can see it in their little beings, you know.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
Yeah. It is, because and that thing, you know, I mean, one of the things, you know, and a proviso on that thing when I said about, you know, we should treat religious education with the same academic rigor. However, we don't treat catechesis as, you know, that element of, you know, I had class before this. I had class from 2 to 3, and we were talking about, you know, the relationship between religious education and that, you know, the informational stuff, and catechesis, which is the formational dimension. That while, yes, absolutely, we should be rigorous in helping the children to understand, you know, the truths of our faith and all the rest of it. But it's all very well and fine to tell them that there are 20 mysteries in the rosary. It's another thing to be able to take down the beads and to be able to pray it and to build up that. So, and that's not something that is quantifiable. And something I find, you find with children is the fact that they are open very much to that. I'm speaking obviously not as a parent. I'm speaking it from a second-hand point of view, I suppose, really. But I do agree. They constantly excite us, and they constantly, I think they constantly renew a hope when you see them excited by what we want to teach them. Sorry, Jeremy.
Okay, 4 o'clock has struck. So thank you very much to John Paul Sheridan. Very helpful and positive.
Thank you very much. Thanks, folks.
Insightful presentation.